approaches in animal disease control programs is at the core of the work that we're going to describe today. And for this reason, and to provide a clear context for the project, over the next few slides, I'm going to briefly highlight these two approaches, including what they are, how they differ, what are the strengths and advantages of each, and also the rationale for an output-based approach as has been used in the current work. Next slide, please. Moving first to input-based approaches, fundamentally they can be described as a focus on what needs to be done and an approach that is prescriptive with respect to the actions to be taken. So I think it's easiest for me to do that by way of illustration. So next slide, please. This is old EU legislation, no longer in force, but old EU legislation that relates to bovine tuberculosis. Just to give you a context, when TB is detected within a herd, the herd is restricted and unable to trade while efforts are undertaken to detect and to remove infection. And the focus here is on the steps that need to be taken once that has been done to enable the herd to return to trade and to regain official TB-free status. And you can see the final 4 lines of the text. This is legislative text, old legislative text, highlights very prescriptively the steps that need to be taken for the herd to return to trade. And it's illustrated in the figure immediately below. You can see that there is a period in the box, a period of restriction, and there's 4 tests, herd tests undertaken during that point. The first and the second test are with a red cross. That's when infection was detected. And the subsequent 2 tests relate to a herd test in which no infected animals were detected. And the legislation essentially says that to return to trade, you need 2 clear tests, 2 tests without any positives, at least 60 days apart for each. And this is an example of an input-based approach, highly prescriptive with a focus on what needs to be done. Next slide, please. The output-based approach is fundamentally different. The focus there is not on what needs to be done, but rather on what needs to be achieved. It's not prescriptive with respect to the approach being taken. Focus on what needs to be achieved. So for endemic diseases, that could be a prevalence threshold. That is, for example, a herd level threshold below a certain point, a level, or for exotic disease, a probability of freedom from infection. Next slide, please. And to give an example of this, again from EU legislation, but this is current legislation, and it relates to Echinococcus multilocularis, and it speaks to the preventive health measures that need to be taken, particularly for those countries that are believed free of this parasite. So as outlined in the text, as outlined in the underlined text, in those countries believed free of infection, there's a requirement for a pathogen-specific surveillance program that, among other things, is able to detect the parasite if present in any part of the country at a designed prevalence of less than 1% with 95% confidence. So there's 4 countries in Europe, Finland, Ireland, Norway, except Svalbard, and also the UK. And these countries are believed free of Echinococcus multilocularis. And each year, EFSA works closely with these countries to determine whether these conditions have been fulfilled in order to remain eligible for preventive health measures to control infection in dogs coming into the territory. So the important thing here, this is an output-based approach, and the primary emphasis is on what needs to be achieved. In this case, a surveillance program that is able to detect this parasite if present at very low levels. Note that there isn't any prescription with respect to the actions to be taken. Next slide, please. So the real strengths of an input-based approach, such as what I illustrated for TB, there's a couple and they're very compelling. The first one is it's clear, it's straightforward, and it's unambiguous. Secondly, we can have confidence that the same approach can be applied uniformly across sectors, across regions, or indeed throughout the EU. And thirdly, it's easy both to communicate and to verify. Next slide, next click, thank you. But there's challenges. And the fundamental challenge is that the assumption that underpins input-based approaches is not correct. And that is, the assumption is that the same outcome can be achieved given an agreed series of actions. But in biological systems, it's complex. And the same effort most certainly cannot guarantee exactly the same result. Rather, the impact of input-based approaches will vary depending on a broad range of risk factors, including different epidemiological situations. So coming back to the earlier TB example, and we consider a herd that has just been released after restriction and returning 2 clear whole herd tests. We know that the TB risk of individuals within that herd at the point of de-restriction will vary greatly depending on a whole range of risk factors. The TB risk nationally or indeed in the locality, the presence of wildlife reservoirs, the size and the number, size and type of herd, the number of reactor animals that were detected during the restriction, and the age of the animal, to name a few. So put another way, next slide please, put another way, the probability of TB for an individual will vary according to context. And that's what we see here in this box. It's not just the input-based approach, but this context, these known risk factors that are really important. So for example, the TB risk for individuals will be much greater if we take, for example, a large dairy herd in a region with high levels of TB, where there's high stocking densities, where there's housing during winter, where there's a wildlife reservoir, as one scenario, compared with an individual animal from a smaller beef herd in a region with very low TB levels, lower stocking densities, year-round grazing, and no wildlife reservoir. If we just go back one slide, please, Hadi. The other challenge we have with input-based approaches is that they can become dated and not reflect current knowledge. So we go back to that old EU legislation, no longer in force, from 1964. So during 1964 till very recently, we used the Council Directive 64432. But in the interim period, our understanding of TB control, including the potential that infected animals may be present but undetected in a herd, has increased substantially over the decades. The legislation in 64 certainly, I'm sure, represented our best understanding of this issue at that point in time, but things have moved on. So as you can see, input-based approaches have strengths. Input-based approaches have strengths, but also considerable challenges that really are very difficult to resolve and to reconcile. And they fundamentally relate to that assumption of the same input does not always achieve the same output. And it's for this reason there's been a shift towards output-based approaches in recent years, both in the context of regulation and also of science. Next slide, please. And output-based approaches have several key advantages. Next slide, please, Hadi. Thank you. Several key advantages. Firstly, it acknowledges that there are multiple routes taken to achieve the same output. And this is really critical. Multiple routes in terms of actions to achieve the same agreed output. Let's imagine if we were to focus, for example, on confidence of freedom or prevalence below a defined level, the output in both of those, the output is clear. And there's acknowledgement using an output-based approach that multiple routes are possible to achieve this output. Secondly, it allows us to focus on the issue of risk. These factors, so-called risk factors, that increase or decrease the likelihood that an output is achieved. And this is absolutely consistent with our epidemiological understanding of infectious disease. And also it's embedded within EU legislation and indeed within policy as well, where risk is embedded in both legislation and policy. Next slide, please. This is really illustrated in this table, which highlights the BVD eradication, the approach to BVD eradication in six European countries. And what we see is that there are multiple routes to achieve the same output. And also we see a focus on risk factors. So as you can see from this table, there's multiple differences between these 6 European countries in terms of the design of the eradication program for BVD, in terms of the current herd level prevalence, the type of program, whether it's mandatory or voluntary, the methods used both for case finding and also building confidence of freedom. And we can see a whole host of different methods, ear notching, blood and serum, bulk milk testing, differences in terms of the use of the vaccine, and also differences in terms of the relative importance of different risk factors. So this is a very clear example reflecting country level differences in those factors that influence the presence, the prevalence, and also the management of BVD. In other words, different routes are being undertaken in different European countries, different risk factors are being managed, but in all of these situations, the end goal is exactly the same, and that is biological freedom from BVD infection. Next slide, please. In my final 2 slides, I wish to very briefly summarize progress towards output-based approaches in animal disease control programs. So firstly, from a regulatory perspective, there has been a dramatic shift from earlier input-based to current output-based approaches. In the EU, the new EU animal health law in force since April this year, output-based approaches are being used very extensively. And that's illustrated in this example here, coming from the Commission delegated regulation with respect to BVD, where, as we can see in the underlying text, that a definition of zone freedom from BVD, it can be achieved only once at least 99.8% of establishments, representing 99.9% of the bovine population of free BVD. So a very, very strong focus on what needs to be achieved. Next slide, please, and my final slide. From a scientific perspective, considerable work has been undertaken, particularly seeking to quantify freedom from infection. And that could be at the level of the animal, the herd, the sector, the zone, or the country. And what we have, if we can imagine, is essentially a spectrum in terms of our certainty of freedom from infection. On the left-hand side, we have no certainty of freedom. In fact, that herd is definitely infected. And on the right, we have absolute certainty that the herd is not infected. And we essentially have herds or animals or sectors or countries sitting at some point along that spectrum from definitely infected through to definitely not infected. And although the concept is clear, and as I said, detailed scientific work has been undertaken now over several decades, there has only been limited scientific progress towards implementation of output-based approaches in a very practical sense. In large part, this is because these approaches are computationally complex, and it's proved difficult to create simple tools usable by colleagues in the field or at national level. I now pass to Herdine to take the story from here. Thank you, Herdine.